That is, parents of the husband, parents of the wife, or the future husband, future wife, would come together and would make an agreement with one another that their children should begin this relationship. Now, this was something that could happen and that often occurred even early on in a child's life. No different than if Catherine and I sought out another couple and said, hey, look, our kids are playing well together. Let's just promise that they'll get married one day, right? That's ultimately what was had, except the arrangement came with much deeper promise, right? It wasn't from a comical standpoint. It was pretty serious. Now, the second stage is the betrothal. The betrothal at this time, a dowry, was paid by the man's wife to the parents, by the man to the wife's parents, and there were actually vows that were exchanged. Vows likened unto what we may have in our wedding ceremony. The woman, however, continued to remain at the home of her parents, and we'll discuss why here in a moment. What I did want to mention, though, is that there are sometimes people who will try to equate the betrothal process, as we're going to discuss, with our modern-day engagement process, as if to say, well, they're in some way accurate in comparison, but they're not. And the biggest difference was that while today we may have a man who gets on a knee and he proposes to his future wife, and he makes a promise to her that they're going to be together, and he puts a ring on her finger, there is no binding contract within that communication. So there are often times when relationships, they sever during that process. Rings are hopefully returned, but in some cases they're not. Don't propose, I guess, if on a holiday, because then that ring becomes hers if it's a present. But nonetheless, that's besides the point. But what you have there is no binding contract between the man and the woman. Betrothal was very much deeper than that. It was deeper than just our modern day engagement. It was a promise. There were vows to be made, but the physical side of that relationship, one could say the consummation aspect of it, had yet to be reached. In fact, in Matthew, it says in chapter 1 and verse 18, so keep your place there in Matthew 25, and go back to Matthew chapter 21. You'll see that in Matthew chapter 21, beginning in verse 18, your subtext or your heading there may even say something of the effect of the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, if you jump down to verse 18, it says, now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way, when his mother Mary had been betrothed. Betrothed, that is, in your does anybody have a point there or a explanation in your Bible? What does it say? Matthew 1, verse 18. Oh, my bad. Matthew 1. Sorry, Elijah, what did you say?
The footnote says the first stage of marriage in ancient Jewish culture usually lasted for years before the wedding night, more legal than an engagement. Okay, more legal than an engagement, right? Legally pledged to be married. That's what mine says under the context of the betrothal, okay? This is important for us to understand, especially when we consider what is going on here in verse 18, because in verse 19, what does it tell us, right? The seriousness of the betrothal is seen when Joseph learns that his wife is pregnant with child, because in verse 19 he says, and her husband Joseph, being a just man, unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly, right? Because he was a just man, he did not want to put her to shame. He said, well, I'll just divorce her quietly. That was the seriousness behind the betrothal, okay? It was more than our modern day engagement. And then it led to ultimately the final part of the wedding, or which was the feast itself, where the families carried out large celebrations. The woman would leave to be with her husband. Consummation of marriage would occur. And the parable that we are going to be looking at today,
The parable of the 10 virgins, or yours may even call it the wise and foolish virgins, takes place in the last phase of that process. It takes place at the wedding feast. So we need to understand that while this is a parable, which is a story within this grand story here, it is a story that Jesus is using to cast alongside, trying to teach a deeper message. The characters within the story, we need to understand, have already gone through that process of arrangement and betrothal. They're now at the wedding feast. Now, this parable is only recorded in Matthew. It is the only place that we're going to find it. The 10 virgins are waiting the arrival of the bridegroom so that they can follow him in. The theme of the parable, as we're going to see, is a preparation for the judgment. And the main lesson that I want us to take from it this morning is be ready, for no one knows the hour that the Lord will come. That's the point that we're trying to preface with our lesson this morning. Any questions or comments as we sort of introduce it before we jump into it? Before we jump into the parable itself, which is a bit of a lie because first slide that would have popped up says context. So we're going to look at the context real quick. All right, so let's consider the context then. Matthew 25, 1 through 13 comes right after Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 and 25 are often taught separately. And the reason they're often taught separately is because people don't like Matthew 24. Matthew 24 can be a rather confusing chapter if you don't understand what it is that is actually happening. It is often a misinterpreted or misrepresented chapter. But in fact, there are verses within it that we can use to not only better understand what the specific chapter is discussing, but also that are going to correlate and connect with the next chapter, which is the parable of the 10 virgins. But also, we need to be careful because there are verses within it that are going to be misused and have been misused even within the church itself. Let's take a look at Matthew 24 real quick. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but that could also be a lie. It's dependent upon the conversation that we have and your willingness to have input within this study. So if you have a question or comment, don't hesitate to just shout my name out, especially if I'm not seeing your hand. Matthew 24, and I want to begin in verses 6 and 8. We're not going to take the time to read through all of it, but what I want us to notice is that there is a distinct correlation in Matthew chapter 24 and the first 35 verses and then verses 36 and following. The first half of this chapter is speaking physically about the destruction of Jerusalem, while the second half of this chapter is speaking about, more specifically, is going to be speaking about the second coming of Christ. And it's that second half especially that we're going to get the wedding feast parable from, right? Because there's a direct connection from chapter 25, verse 1 to 24, verses 36 through 51. So if we take a look at verses 6 through 8, it says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." There are a number of people who will take these verses, especially verses 6 and 8, remove them from their context and say that a lot of what we are dealing with, a lot of the wars, a lot of the bombings, a lot of the chaos, a lot of the famine, a lot of the unsettling lack of peace within our world is evident that we are going through the birth pains process of the second coming of Christ. But here's the thing. It's not talking about the second coming of Christ. And there's absolute evidence within this in order to understand that. If you look closely, you'll notice that he's talking about the destruction of the holy city of Jerusalem. How do we know that? Well, let's jump to verse 15 real quick. Jump to verse 15. Take a look at what it says in 24, verse 15. "So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So how can we take these verses and use them in order to understand that this isn't the second coming of Christ, but rather what we're discussing is the destruction of Jerusalem?
Specific instructions about the Sabbath and other activities that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last verse, it mentions that it was on the Sabbath,
Mm-hmm.
and weather and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Very specific.
Very specific. What else? Yes, sir.
There's opportunities to run away.
There you go. There's an opportunity to escape whatever this calamity is that's being discussed here, right? He basically says, look, if you're out in the fields, turn and run. If you're on the rooftop, don't go down, try to pack a bag. Don't go down, try to collect all your things. Turn and run. And then there's a warning even given, right? There's a warning that is being given by Christ himself. He says, look, if you're pregnant, if you're nursing, I'm sorry. But pray that it is not in the winter. Pray that it's not on the set. Pray that it's not on a day that is going to make what you are doing here, which is fleeing the abomination of desolation, right? Difficult. When we're discussing the destruction of Jerusalem, there is an opportunity to flee. When we're discussing the second coming of Christ, there is no opportunity to flee, right? When Jesus decides to return, at that point, we will all experience, to some degree, the definition of hopelessness, which is there is nothing more that we can do to determine our eternal salvation. There's nothing more we can say. There's nothing more than we can beg. There's nothing more we can give. At that point, our eternity is sealed. We'll stand before God. We'll give an account for the things we did, that we did not do. There's no way to escape that day. But that's not what we're looking at here. So then how do we uncover the difficult language that oftentimes seems apocalyptic, which is why it's given focus as the second coming of Christ, like the abomination of desolation? Well, that's actually a reference, and we're told by Daniel. There's actually 3 places that Daniel speaks of it. Chapter 9 and verse 27, chapter 11 and verse 31, chapter 12 and verse 11. At least those are 3 of the more obvious places. And I want to just look at the first one, because Daniel is not discussing, again, the second coming, but rather, at least in the first part of this, in chapter 9 and verse 27, he's discussing the encirclement. He's talking of the encirclement by the Roman armies around the holy city prior to its destruction. Take a look at Daniel 9 and verse 27. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Okay. Why does all of this matter to you and I? What is the purpose of all of this? Well, if the beginning of Matthew 24 was speaking of the second coming of Christ, there would be no hope to flee to the mountains, nor would Christ pray that this wasn't in winter, right? And this is where things become difficult. And I think the reason why people struggle most with chapter 24 is in verses 29 through 31. 29 through 31. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, our discussion is Matthew 25, right? I believe, just quickly, because and by all means, if there's anybody who would like to make a comment, question on 29 through 31, by all means. But I believe that we're discussing the period after the destruction of Jerusalem, the scattering of the believers, the sending of God's messengers to those scattered believers. And in fact, Luke and Luke's account, because remember, Matthew is the only account that we have the parable of the 10 virgins, but it is not the only account that we see the destruction of Jerusalem being described. And Luke's account, in Luke 21, verse 44, it says this, speaking of that destruction, Luke 21, verse 44, says, they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So in Luke's account, he's discussing this destruction, and he says that this destruction will occur, and with that, the time of the Gentiles, at least in that power, will begin and will remain until that time has been fulfilled. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some great preachers and teachers that I have longed to sit at the feet of and to hear and to study from, who do believe that verses 29 through 31 is absolutely apocalyptic. But since we're looking at the parables, in order to understand chapter 25, we need to understand chapter 24, at least the context. Take a look at what comes right after what we just read. Take a look at verses 32 through 35. Okay, now remember, the reason we're not going into greater detail in this discussion is because we're focused on 25. We're just laying down a little foundation to help us understand why does Jesus use this time, this opportunity to introduce this parable. But look at the lesson of the fig tree, or the parable of the fig tree. It says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Okay. It's a very important verse in there to help us to understand that everything we've looked at before is not speaking of the second coming, but rather the destruction of Jerusalem. And what verse is that? What is said in that little section of Scripture, in that parable, or in that lesson of the fig tree that helps us to understand that everything that we've looked at up to this point cannot be about the second coming of Christ? Okay, all these things will happen, and more specifically, that this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Okay, that means that if we are to believe that what is being said prior to this is speaking of the second coming, that the entire chapter, as some believe, is apocalyptic, it's talking about the second coming of Christ, then there has to be at least one person from within that generation who has outlived everybody that has come before. But there is a switch, and that switch begins in verse 35 and into 36. Because Jesus is going to make a distinction now between the destruction of Jerusalem, which for many felt like the end of the world, to what actually was going to be the end of the world. And in verse 35, he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Right? What's he talking about? Well, if you look at verse 35, he talks about the day in which heaven and earth will pass away. Right? So he makes a switch here in verse 35, going into 36, where his focus is no longer going to be about the destruction of Jerusalem, where there are going to be signs. right? They would have known that the destruction of Jerusalem was at their front door. They would have been privy to all of the evidences that were leading up. Daniel prophesied about it. Jesus is warning them about it, right? He's telling them that if they follow everything that they have seen, like the fig tree, they see the leaves, they see the fruits about to sprout, look at the evidence and you'll know that the city is about to be destroyed, at which you can flee. However, when it comes to the destruction of heaven and earth, no one knows. No one knows the hour. No one knows the day. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, there were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake. You do not know what day the Lord is coming, but know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour he does not know. He will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In other words, what Jesus says is, if you've got two servants and you've got one master, and the master says he is going to come, you've got 2 different servants, the wise and the foolish. The wise servant says, well, I'm going to continue to do as the master has said. The foolish servant says, well, if the master's delayed, why don't we just live how we want to live, do what we want to do? To which Jesus says, but what if the master returns when you're living how you want to live and doing what you want to do? At which point you're going to have to be held accountable for your actions. And then it goes right into 25. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. See, if we only jump into chapter 25 without laying down the context, we don't understand why this parable is given to us at this point. And the fact of the matter is that Jesus has had a destruction about their physical doom, the destruction of Jerusalem, but more importantly, what he wants them to consider is not the physical life, but the spiritual. That has always been his purpose. And so when it comes to the spirituality of Jesus, right, when it comes to the spirituality of man, we need to recognize that a day is coming in which we're going to have to give an account for all the things we did and did not do. But the fact of the matter is we don't know when that day will be. And because we don't know when that day will be, how do we behave? As if it's today. As if today is the day that we will stand before God. As if today is the day we will have to give an account. Now, is it wrong to make plans for tomorrow or a week? No. But we live with the mindset of this could be my last day. And because this could be my last day, is my heart right with God? We sing the song, but do we understand the implication behind the words? All right, any questions or comments before we jump into the actual parable that we're considering in our Bible class on the parables of Jesus? I didn't say, no difficult questions. Rolling. All right, go ahead. Is it going to be, let me guess, is it verses 39 through 44 when he says one will be taken away and one will be not? Well, let's talk about the second coming for just a moment. What do we know about the second coming of Christ? Because what I will tell you is For those that believe in the concept or the idea of the rapture, this is one of their favorite verses to take from, right? But what do we know about the second coming of Christ?
It appears to be Judgment Day.
Yeah, appears to be that we're looking at the Judgment Day. And what do we know? When David Harrell, and he did a wonderful job talking about what happens, especially after death, right? The second coming of Christ. When discussing in that class, we're talking about, okay, what happens on that day? He speaks of the dead will rise, those will go to be with God, right? I think that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at the literal judgment day, or he's speaking of the judgment day in which God has separated the sheep from the goats, right? He's separating the wheat from the chaff. He's taking those who have heard or will hear thy good and faithful servant, well done. And then those who have not are being forced to do depart. That's what I think we're witnessing here in that moment. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, everybody stands before God. And I think that's a very important point to be made, especially when you consider the context to the parable of the 10 virgins, which, interestingly enough, when we begin to discuss the parable of the 10 virgins, the one thing that I do want you to understand is that this is not a parable of good versus evil. It's not a parable of 5 who are a part of the kingdom and 5 who are not. Every one of the 5 or of the 10 virgins were of the same mindset. It's just that of those 10, 5 of them were faithful and 5 of them were not. And the reason I preface that before we look at it is because this parable is a direct look at the church today, which is that we have a body of believers who we could all be in the same room, but the question becomes, if the Lord returned, how many of us here would actually be ready? We may all be here, but how many of us have brought enough oil, so to speak, for seeing the Lord? And so with that, let's take a look at the parable itself. Any additional questions or comments? All right. Matthew chapter 25. We're going to break this down. Instead of reading it in its entirety, we'll read a couple verses and we'll get an opportunity to have a discussion. Matthew 25, verses 1 and 2. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps, went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Verse 1 begins with the word then, right? That's that direct connection with the context that we have been discussing, right? So this is talking about what? What is the direct context? The second coming of Christ. So what is the parable about? Well, we're going to be discussing a parable that is highlighting ultimately the second coming of Christ. Now, notice first that all 10 are said to be virgins. That's sort of what we were alluding to a moment ago. At one point, they were all pure. At one point, they were all prepared. At one point, they were all ready. As children of God, we are to be prepared to meet the bridegroom. And all 10 of them set out to do that, to meet the bridegroom. The difference is that 5 of them were well prepared and 5 of them were underprepared. And that is the deeper meaning that I think Christ is really trying to get his disciples to see. Is that when it comes to our spiritual lives, how many of us would be labeled as wise and how many of us would be labeled as unwise? And let's ask the question first, well, what makes one wise? What is it that makes one wise? Okay. Okay, preparation. What else? Discernment. Forethought, right? Doing what God has asked you to do. That's what makes you wise. That's the definition of wisdom. The foolish here, right, aren't the unconverted. These are members of the kingdom. If we're looking at it in a connection with you and I, they're members of the church who are unprepared to meet God. And here's the powerful thing. When God calls somebody foolish, they're a fool, right? It's not, oh, well, He's just being foolish. But he's good. He has a kind heart. No, when he calls someone a fool, they are a fool. The same way when he calls someone a hypocrite, they are a hypocrite. That was not a positive thing, right? That wasn't as though, oh, he's being coy, that guy. No, this was a serious thing. In Psalm 14, verse 1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, right? They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. That's what it says in Psalm 14:1 with the description of the fool. And so, add to that, by the way, I have a few other verses. Matthew 7:26, but everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Luke 12:20, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? Every time where we see this word being used to describe people, it is not positive. And in fact, it is equated to those that will be a part of that weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? This is not a good thing to be listed among the foolish. Take a look at verses 3 and 4. Those who were foolish took their lamps, took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. So five virgins, right? 5 women, young ladies, continued to stay prepared, and 5 did not. What we take, or what anyone takes to the judgment, right, bar of Christ, is all the preparation that can be made. That's the point. Is that here we have these 10 young ladies who are waiting for the bridegroom, which was customary to usher in the bridegroom and the bride into their room. The door would be shut. The marriage would be consummated. Right? That was their purpose, to usher in the bridegroom through the door. Well, 5 of them came prepared, and 5 of them did not. And so when Christ returns, ultimately the point that I think is being made is that what we bring to that judgment bar, because that's what this whole parable is discussing here, everything we bring is all the preparation that we have made. And in fact, when you look at Paul writing to the saints in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, he says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So whatever preparations you have made for that day, that is all the preparations that have been made, that can be made. And when we consider the Ecclesiastes writer in chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, the wisest of all men, right? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so we have these 10 young ladies. 5 of them have brought enough oil. 5 of them have not. 5 of them are prepared to meet God. 5 of them are not. Even though they were of all the same, right? They were a part of the same church, if you will, right? They're all the same virgins. They're all pure. Not all of them were prepared. Take a look at verses 5 and 6. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. While the bridegroom tarried, your translation may say, right? The delay of the second coming. That's what some people believe this is discussing. But here's the thing. Jesus spoke of the second coming of Christ and then said what? No one knows the hour. And so now what are we doing? We're waiting. We're waiting. And many in that day thought he was going to come in their time. Right? They were convinced that Jesus was going to return while they were still alive. And so there is this sense of delay in their minds, and there's a sense of, well, I thought he was going to return again. But the point being is that in the midst of that delay, in the midst of that waiting, what do we see them doing? Well, we see them slumber. We see them sleep. Well, the slumbering and slept here was the most intriguing part of my study. It's actually where I spent the majority of my time this past week in preparation, because it seems to carry with it the thought that they were not awake or aware that time was about to run out. And this is highlighted in a few verses. In Mark 13:32, of that day and that hour, no one knows, not even the angels. We read that. But 2 Peter 3:10 was another. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat, but both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. And so, initially, that was the thought, right? They were not awake or aware that time was about to run out. That because the second coming was being delayed, or the approach of the bridegroom had been delayed. And then I found myself intrigued by the fact that a number of scholars and commentators have begun to believe that what is actually being spoken of here is death itself. And that the sleep that is being mentioned of in the parable might be identified with the sleep of death. And here is their reasoning. And I'm offering it to you because I find it intriguing. That the sleep ended only when the midnight cry heralded the second coming, which is symbolized by the coming of the bridegroom. Because both the unready and the ready entered into that sleep. In other words, what Jesus might be talking about here is that while we are here on this earth, we have to live, but we have to be prepared. But while we are waiting for the second coming of Christ, there are going to be some who die in that process. And if that is what is being discussed here, right? Death must come alike to all the ready and the unready. That it's going to befall all the ready and the... It's intriguing to me. Which of these is correct? Well, I can't tell you for certain, and I have no problem saying that. Because my initial gut reaction has always been that in the midst of the delay, they slept, they waited. It's just a waiting period, but at least 5 of them were still prepared and 5 of them were not. I think it's an intriguing thought and concept if this is talking about death itself. But what the parable teaches us is that one day time will run out, period. In 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17 says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of the God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then those who are alive will and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus they shall be with the Lord. Thus shall always be with the Lord." All right. We're running out of time, so let's take a look real quick, 7 through 9. Then all those virgins arose, trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "No, lest there should be not enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves." And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered and said, "Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." Now, the reason why I tend to not believe that it's death is because they awake and then they still have hope, right? So that tends to be why I disagree with some of the scholars and commentators. But nonetheless, what we see in this parable, right, is on the judgment day, no one will be able to share the oil of preparation, no matter how badly we might desire to do so. There's no amount of hope that I can have to say, well, you know what, I'm going to pay for Brother Patrick's salvation, right? I'm gonna throw in a few extra amens and Hail Marys, and right. But see, that's just it. That's what I grew up believing, because that's what I was taught, right? That I could help with my a certain amount of donation to purchase somebody's salvation. On top of that, There's no amount of good I can do that is going to save somebody else. We are all have to work out our own salvation. We're all judged according to the record of our own lives, right? That the judgment of mankind will be on an individual basis. We'll either stand or we'll fall based on the record that we have laid out for ourselves. But if you look at verse 10, right, we see this sense of striving for hope. But the most painful part of this whole verse is it says the door was shut, right? The door was shut. They were not impure. They were not immoral. They were unprepared. That's the saddest part of this, is we're not talking about people who were not a part of the body. We're talking about 10 people who looked the same, but 5 of them were just not prepared. And because of their unpreparation, because they were not ready for when the Lord came, the door was shut. It reminds me of the 7 or the woes of the scribes and the Pharisees in chapter 23, and it's verse 23 that says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone." Bottom line, and in some cases, for you and I, the most powerful thing that we can take from the parable of the 10 virgins is, it doesn't matter how many times we come to worship, it doesn't matter how many times we give, if we're not doing the complete will of God, the door will be shut on us. So what do? Well, we got to do the complete will of God. Well, how much time do we have? We don't know that. And that's the whole point. Are you ready for that judgment day? Any questions or comments? Any questions? Yes.
7:21 through 23.
Mm-hmm.
Do the will of the Father in my heaven.
Yeah.
In heaven, regardless of whatever else you do. And Jesus says the same thing in both places.
Yeah.
Do not know who you are. Never had a connection.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You know, and here's real quick, because this is important. The Lord says, "I know you not I never knew you." He told the 5 that were unprepared, "I don't know you." Not that I never knew you. I don't know you now. And that's super powerful. Is that it's not he knew them, but it's the fact that because you were unprepared, I now don't know you. And that's not what we want to hear. All right. If there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and stand dismissed. Appreciate your time and attention this